Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Edward Diener Lecture. I'm Kelsey O'Connor with ISQOLS and Static Research. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Nick POWDTHAVEE. But before introducing Professor POWDTHAVEE, I'd like to take a moment to honor Ed Diener, the namesake for our lecture series. As many of you know, Ed Diener passed away earlier this year. I need not say much about his contributions to our field. He was a pioneer of positive psychology. I know many of you knew him, and he will be missed. Let's take a short moment of silence in his memory. Okay, now time to welcome Professor POWDTHAVEE.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for attending, and it's a shame that I can't be with you in person. And it is very honored to be given the opportunity to present my work, my colleagues' work, especially in the memory of Ed Diener's lecture. So thank you very much for that. And I know that all of us have had such a difficult for 18, 19 months now. So today's talk will be a little bit about that. And I would also like to hear some of your experiences as well in terms of research and what you've done, perhaps at the end of my talk when we are doing Q&A. So today,
Nick, sorry to interrupt. I have your bio here too. If I can.
Oh, sure. Yes, of course.
Just give you a nice external background to highlight some of your your achievements.
You're too kind. Thank you.
Sure. So we're honored to have Nick here today. So he's one of the most prominent happiness scholars, I would say, from the new generation of happiness researchers in economics. So we're really pleased to have him here today. So Nick POWDTHAVEE joined Warwick Business School as a professor of behavioral science in 2016, after holding positions at the London School of Economics, University of Melbourne, Nanyang Technological University, and University of York. He specializes in happiness and behavioral economics, and has published over 50 research articles in these two broad areas. He's the author of the popular science book called The Happiness Equation, The Surprising Economics of the Most Valuable Asset, and is a recipient of the ISQOLS Research Fellowship Award 2017. So I just wanted to provide a small amount of additional background for those of you who may not know you beforehand. And with that, I can pass the floor back over to you.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for joining us as well. So today's talk will be about well-being and behavioral challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure many of you would have your own opinion and your own experience about this. Of course, this is joint research with many, many people, so it's not just me. And I listed the people's names below, so you could see many of them. But basically, the talk today will be based on, let me see if this works. Yep, 3 different studies that I have been fortunate to be involved in. 2 of them is already published, one in Journal of Public Economics, and another one would be in PLOS One. And the other paper is just basically, it's never going to be published because we wrote it as a policy piece to advise the UK government and many governments around the world. So let's start the talk. As you know, well, as you all know, we've been through so much this past 18, 19 months. At the start of the pandemic, especially in March, when everything kind of stopped, we were told to stay at home. All the surveys at that time were told to stop. We can't do any face-to-face interviews. Of course, one of the biggest challenges in well-being research and also in public policy is if we don't have the data, especially on people's well-being, how would we ever do the kind of evaluation of how does the pandemic and especially the lockdown, which is a government lockdown that many countries have experienced and still currently experiencing, have affected our subjective well-being, right? When self-reported subjective well-being were not readily available. So that was the first research challenge that we faced. So here, this is Boris Johnson, our current UK Prime Minister. So at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm very thankful to be in this country because the UK government started reaching out very early to academics everywhere. They wanted to create this, force of knowledge, to drive policies through research. But of course, one of the biggest things that or research themes that they wanted to know was how would the decision to go into national lockdown. So in the UK, we went through this, and same in many parts of Europe and some, states in America, really, really full lockdown, that we can't go anywhere, that will have a huge impact upon our lives, just because we have this, huge health concern that we wanted to save lives in the short to medium run. But of course, as I said earlier, if all the surveys had to stop, initially we didn't really have any data on subjective well-being. How would we analyze, how this lockdown could have impacted people? I mean, we have some rough ideas. We knew that limiting people's freedom, the loss of jobs, the fear for our lives, our health when there were no vaccines, could have a huge detrimental impact upon our overall well-being. We just didn't really know how much, and we didn't really know how to measure it and evaluate it. So my colleagues and I thought, well, without data, without the subjective well-being data, maybe we could ask Google. Maybe we could find data sourced from somewhere else. So, so some of you might know, if you go to Google, so this is the paper. If you're interested more in the paper, you can have a look in the Journal of Public Economics. The paper is called COVID-19 Lockdowns and Wellbeing, Evidence from Google Trends. So I have to give a lot of credit to to our first causer, which is Abel here. He's a professor in Ottawa, in Canada. So he came up with the idea that, well, we know this Google Trends where anybody can access. So if you haven't before, you go to Google and you just type Google Trends, right? And Google Trends will take you to basically a data that you could search, and it will give you information about, if you put in a word, and it will basically give you data on people's search activities, which as economists, we could take that as kind of a revealed preference. That it reveals that if you are, let's say, if you want to do something, if you want to go somewhere, you search for it. If there's a huge demand for it, we will observe that in the search activity. Correlate that with a lot of studies in in sentimental data research, where people look at whether or not the stocks will go up or down, and they just have a look at Google Trends and they can see search activities, and those are very powerful predictors. And so they just to give you some taste of this. It'll give you some kind of predictors of what people are thinking at the time. Right. So we thought, okay, since we don't really have any better data in this, let's try to have a look at Google Trends. And if you go to Google, you can search for either term or topic. And what we basically did is that we went into the sentiment analysis literature and found that Google Trends can be used to predict so many things of people's behaviors, things like disease outbreaks, tourism flows, trading behaviors. And then we link it to another literature, which is quite recent work, looking at people's emotions, things from Twitter, tweets in Twitter. It predicts very well on how people are feeling at the time. There's a latest study by Thomas Hu et al., which is my colleague here at Warwick, which was published in Nature Human Behavior, that looked at the words that used in books over the centuries, and how they use the words that published in books and put it through basically kind of word analysis, and they chuck out all this emotion related content. And they found that if there's a lot, the books write a lot and have a lot of negative emotion words, it kind of correlate quite well with the average well-being of a country. So we thought that's great. And so then we can look at what people search, the way they feel, and use that as a good proxy for how they might be feeling at the time. So this is the search topics that we did. We trying to think of all sorts of words that we're trying to see, okay, how does these search activities change over time? So we do things like boredom, contentment, divorce, impairment. So it's not just about happiness, it's about unhappiness, suicide, well-being, worry, all these sort of things. And note that the study took place in April 2020. So we did this really, really early on. So I think we're one of the first people to try to analyze well-being at the very early on of the pandemic. So the data we used came from basically 1st of January to mid-April of 2020, and we're trying to compare that to the same time in 2019 when we didn't have pandemic. Now the problem is, and I don't know if any of people who are listening want to do similar research on not just on well-being, but on any other things using Google Trends. One of the concerns that we had was that because we need to know, well, we knew on which day and in which country the government imposed the lockdown restriction. So we need daily data from Google search because we want to know, how the extent of people searching through these words, through these topics at each given day before and after the lockdown being imposed. The problem is the daily data on Google search is only provided for a query period that is no longer between 9 months, from 9 months up to about 36 hours before. So it's not great in that sense. Right? So you can only see a cross-section, the daily search. But of course, in order to do a proper analysis, we need to look further back than just 9 months. We need to compare the trends of Google search in the year of the pandemic to the Google search in the same time, but the year before. And that's go beyond 9 months. Because if you go beyond 9 months, we don't have daily data anymore. We don't have weekly data in Google Trends. So weekly data is provided for periods between 9 months and 5 years. You can go back up to 5 years. So to obtain daily data, some rescaling is required. So the next few slides will be slightly technical, but I'll go through it fairly quickly. And if you want more details, you can find it in the published article. So here we have, so in Google Trends, within a given period, it's kind of a relative scale that is 0 to 100, right? So 100 being, that's a huge searching activities going, and 0 being relatively compared in that period, there's nothing going on. So we can have a number of Google daily searches for a topic on a day. I in country C over the period of January 1st, 2019 to April 10, 2019. And then we have the same for 2020. But these two are not directly comparable because they are from 2 different periods and they're relative scale. We wish to calculate, we want to rescale all of these daily data so that they can be comparable, which is slightly difficult, but we thought of a way. And so we type up this scaling procedure where we take the daily data from 1st of January to 2019 to 10th of April 2019, and then we aggregate this daily data into weekly data. Because going beyond that, we have only just the weekly data. And then we do the same for 2020. So from weekly data over the entire period, we also observe DIC 2019 to 2020. So what we did was, and sorry to just kind of brush this off very quickly, is that we tried to find the different ways that, that these Google Trends use. So we can calculate the VUC 2019 and the VUC 2020 based on this procedure. And then we just basically use that weight to work out what would be the daily data and rescale everything so that all the daily data are comparable. So just to save time, you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email me how to do this. Otherwise, please have a look at the paper. I think it outlines much better in the way that I'm describing at the moment. But basically, the data that we have after rescaling, they are comparable from 1st of January 2019 to 10th of April 2020. And the method that we follow is a difference approach. So we have the well-being here, which is basically the Google search trends as the outcome. We have the timing of the lockdown for each country at each different in 2020. Then we have the year. Then we have the interaction of it. So we have the variables xi minus 1. So that's the lack of controls, which is basically the number of deaths of COVID-19 per day per million in country or state C. And we have country fixed effects and all of these things that, like daily effects are trying to condition for all the nuance of this regression. But just to go to the results, what we found was quite fascinating to us, at least, is that for Western European, so we looked at basically mostly Western European countries and United States, right? Because different regions have either full lockdown or partial lockdown in the United States. What we found was that there is a huge increase, especially in Western European countries, on the day of the lockdown being imposed in boredom. For the US, it's kind of steady rising even before the day of the lockdown. But this increase in boredom, which is the red line here compared to the gray line, which is 2019, it's kind of stable. It doesn't really come down. So people were really bored. That's something that they were so bored following this lockdown restrictions. And then we look at loneliness. There's an increase in loneliness in 2022 compared to 2019, but then it kind of comes down about a month after. We don't see a huge rise, a huge kind of discontinuity in terms of sadness, but then there is some evidence that it does rises over time. So these are some numbers. So here we see the bottom is the one that has a huge increase right at the start. But this is Western European countries. I guess, funnily enough, there's a decline in search of divorce as the lockdown happened. But as we know now, the longer the lockdown goes on, there's a huge increase in, I think, my wife is a lawyer, and she told me that there's a huge increase of the number of people wanting to get divorced after 3 months into the lockdown. But we didn't see that right at the beginning. Interestingly, at the beginning of lockdown, there's a decline in stress and in the search for suicide, but there's also a decline in well-being search as well. But the bottom, and it's a huge increase in worry. But the bottom is the one that has experienced the largest increase. And America is similar to Europe. Here, as you can see the bottom. But just to illustrate, you can see here bottom being the biggest thing that has kind of gone up in terms of search intensity. This is looking over time. Bottom doesn't really decline the longer the lockdown. Right? So this is weeks elapsed since the stay-at-home order. Loneliness went up, but then kind of declined. So I think it has been taken care of a little bit, but then there's a rise in sadness for the United States. This is just to round up the kind of robustness checks that we did. We did a regression discontinuity design as well. If you don't know what that is, basically we're looking at the period just before and after of the lockdown stay-at-home order, and then we see this huge discontinuity in boredom, especially for boredom. Now, what does that tell us? Right? What does this paper tell us? Well, the paper kind of tells us that the well-being has definitely been impacted. There is some degree of sadness, changes in worries, but the huge thing that happened is the changes in boredom in terms of search activities. And there's very little mean reversion as well. The biggest lesson that we learned from this study is that there might be, this could be taken as evidence of behavioral fatigue of being in lockdown. Because if you know that one of the goals of lockdown is to try to limit people, limit mobility, limit movement, save lives. But if there is behavioral fatigue, that people are bored being in a lockdown, chances are that they're not going to stay compliant for very long. People are going to break rules. And if we, let's say, stop locking down and then the case goes up again, we have to lock down again, chances now that people who have experienced a lot of boredom previously will just, will just not comply. And it will be much harder to impose the same policy in the future. So that's one of the big findings. Another finding is that the young might be the one who suffered the most from the lockdown. Now, obviously, we didn't get a chance to look at subjective well-being, but of course, the studies that came after us that actually were able to collect the subjective well-being data kind of find consistent findings. The reason why we say that the young might be the one who suffered the most from the lockdowns because the majority of people who use Google tend to be the young. And so there might be the people who suffer the most from the lockdown. And as we know, there's a lot of research that came out after this as well that shows that under 25s and women were basically financially worst hit by the lockdown policies. And surely that must have had a huge impact on their mental health and their overall well-being, especially people who are young, who still look forward for the opportunities in life, and they didn't really get that. So that kind of brings us quite nicely into a second study, which I'll talk a little bit about in just a while. Of course, the study, because the boredom finding implies that the young may also be the least likely to adhere to the lockdown rules, and we can see a lot of research that shows afterwards that the young, especially young men, are more likely to ignore lockdown. They would just kind of break lockdown rules and just not adhere to it, and kind of leading to more spread of the virus. Yeah, again, a European survey found that coronavirus lockdown hits younger people harder, and they are the least likely to adhere to the lockdown rules. So then, getting all this information, the second challenge that we face as researchers is how should the government balance between saving lives, which is basically trying to limit mobility, get people to stay at home, and saving the economy, because the economy is severely damaged by the lockdown policy, and the people who are suffering the most were the young. And now this is going back to April of last year when there was still no vaccine in sight. Now, obviously, we have vaccine now. We know what we need to do. But back then, we didn't really have a clear exit strategy to the lockdown policy. So that leads on to my second study that I was involved with Andrew as well, as many of you would know who Andrew is. So we wrote this kind of short policy paper called The Case for Releasing the Young from Lockdown, a briefing paper for policymakers. This is in April 2020. And what we know very well now, back in April 2020, we didn't know as well. So we found a very, very powerful result, which is widely known now, and that is COVID affected the old much more than it does on the young. Because here what I'm showing here is the case fatality rate. So number of deaths by COVID-19 in that age group. So basically, there's a huge age gradient by COVID. So here, this is a log risk scale, basically the number of times, the people in the 65 to 69 were nearly like 100 times more likely to, in terms of mortality rate, compared to the, to 25 to 29. So it's a huge gradient in terms of age, in terms of fatality rate. We know a lot about this now, but we didn't, this is new information that we had at that time. Here we found that for UK, we found that for Italian data. So what did we find? So first we know that, okay, the young are less affected by the virus, but they're more affected in terms of their mental health, their job opportunities, their education. So it was quite controversial at the time. This is the same data, the data from China. Well, Andrew and I thought that, okay, one possibility of an exit strategy is to do a staggered release of the young. Because if the young are the people who suffered the most from being locked down, and they suffered the least from catching the disease and having a severe reaction to it, then they should be the people who are being released first. And they could go about and get the economy started. And we worked out that that could, I think there's 4 million, under 30s in the UK, and that could boost, I don't remember now in terms of the how much it would boost the economy, but it boosts quite a lot. Of course, the idea seems crazy now that we have the vaccine, but back then we didn't have the vaccine inside. So the research came out and it went everywhere. It was discussed at Whitehall. Here, the FT discussed it. British banks on use to lead way out of lockdown. Andrew gave a talk, I think in America about it. The Times wrote an article about it. And it was discussed very, very seriously within the UK government and in Australia as well. Of course, it was rejected as an idea. I think people were still very, very risk averse then. And we are very, very thankful that we found the vaccine, people discovered the vaccine. And we know that now there's a better exit strategy to it. But the reason why I want to talk about this now is, in hindsight, it's because back at the time we thought it was a really good idea, and it was a part of thing that we as well-being researchers could contribute to the discussion of public policy and how we could deal with this kind of problem when there is almost like a social dilemma problem going on between saving lives and saving the economy. So the third challenge, I think I'm making good time, that we found now that even when we found solution, that we have vaccines, we know a much more concrete exit strategy, we know how it impacts people's well-being. The challenge now is actually not really a well-being challenge as such, but a behavioral challenge. And that is, how do we get people to first take up vaccines? How do we get people, especially in America, to continue to wear face masks in public? So, and all of these things, to maintain social distancing, because COVID is not going to go away. It's going to be with us for forever, perhaps. We don't know. Right? So now this is the war of the unvaccinated. It's a war of people who do not wear face masks, the people who do not, all of these things. So one of the, just to pick out of one of the problems, out of many, many problems that we have, is the fact that why in America, especially in America, and maybe Kelsey can weigh in on this as well later, there's a huge divide in terms of face masks. Right? So going back early last year, when Donald Trump was still the president, there's a huge kind of divide between people who support Republican, people who support Democrats, and people who support Democrats tend to be the people who adhere to the social distancing rule, wear face masks. People in Republicans didn't. Right? And we thought that that was the main reasons, but we wanted to kind of prove that and to see that is it divided by the political line, or could it be something else completely different? Right? So the third challenge is we wanted to explain why many people choose not to adhere to the face mask rule, especially in America. Here, it's just to give you some taste of evidence. Here, mask wearing becomes a new battleground. Oh, actually, it's not just in America, it's in England as well, as COVID rules are eased. So it's not a problem back in 2020, it's still a problem now. And here why Americans so angry about masks, it's masks, it's this face mask, but that's a huge divide, a lot of protests, a lot of anger. Why? So we want to test this. So this is the paper that I did with my colleagues in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. We thought, well, let's apply some behavioral game theory to test this. Right, so this is a paper called When Face Masks Signal Social Identity, when we're trying to explain the deep face mask divide during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we did was, well, before I go to the research design, just want to talk a little bit about assumptions about mask wearers. Who are these people who decide to wear masks, and how are they different from people who decide not to wear masks? So one assumption is that mask wearers could be innately much more altruistic. They are in terms, they're pro-social, they might have a strong preference for caring for others and equality for all. So this is a paper by Chan, which is published in Personality and Individual Difference. What he did was he went and interviewed people in terms of personality traits, and they found that people who adhere to social distancing rules, people who decide to wear face masks, they tend to report higher in terms of just, in terms of personality dimension of caring for others and equality for all. So you can imagine that, there might be that the country is split into people who are pro-social and people who are not. And if that is the case, if that is the assumption, then if you were to put them into a public goods game where they're playing against a stranger, people who wear face masks should be individuals who are more cooperative, right, than people who do not wear face masks, where there is real money at stake. Because they think that if I cooperate, I know that I could gain more from cooperating than not. So that could be one of the assumptions, that mask wearers should be more cooperative than non-mask wearers in a public good game. So we want to see their revealed preference, their actual behavior in a social dilemma setting. So non-mask wearers will want to defect when they're playing either against mask or non-mask wearers. So because non-mask wearers are, basically relatively less pro-social, we should also observe that in a public goods game, because if that is the case, if that is the assumption. But of course, there is an alternative theory about our behavior, and that is the social identity theory. And basically, the social identity theory is talks about in-group versus out-group members. So here, mask wearers will be more likely to cooperate when playing against another mask wearer, which is the in-group people, and defect when playing against a non-mask wearer, which is the out-group people. On the other hand, non-mask wearers will be more likely to cooperate when playing against another non-mask wearers, which is the people who are in the same group, and less likely to cooperate when playing a mask wearer, which is the out-group people. Of course, the only distinction here is that if it's true that non-mask wearers are non-cooperative, they're just not going to cooperate with anybody, whether they're mask wearers or non-mask wearers. The only difference is that if there is an in-group versus out-group membership, then non-mask wearers will always want to cooperate more with people who are non-mask wearers as well. Just to complete this kind of design, what we basically did was we, between 9 December 2020 to 14 December 2020, we went on Prolific, which is basically, if you don't know what Prolific is, it's great. It's like a recruitment platform to run experiments, to run surveys. So it's prolific.ac, I think. But if you search for it, you can find it, you can use it, and it's really good. So we recruited 615 participants from the US, and then we interviewed them about their mask wearing activities, their political affiliation, and we got them to play public good games against other people. So if you know what public good games is, basically you have your action and other person's action. You either want to cooperate or defect. If you choose to cooperate and the other person independently choose to cooperate, then you both gain a lot from that. So 3-3 here. But if you cooperate and the other person defect, then the person who defects will gain 5, and you gain nothing. But if you both defect, you get 1 and 1, right? So the Nash equilibrium here, or the dominant strategy in any public good games would be to defect. So that's the Nash equilibrium. Whether you start your goal is trying to defect. But what did we find? Okay, so we have 52% were males, 35% were Democrats. And of course, in December, had we done the research earlier, we're probably going to have a higher percentage of non-mask wearers. But of course, we did it in December, and a lot of people did start wearing masks then. We only got about 10% of non-mask wearers, about 59 out of 615. And we did this in 2 stages. So in the first stage, we just get them to play without giving them no information whatsoever about who the other person is. We didn't even ask them about their mask wearing activities. So there's no priming whatsoever, right, in the public good games. And then we ask them about their mask wearing activities. Then we get them to play again. So so they would have a bit more salient about their own mask wearing activity. And then in the second stage, we ask them how would they react if they play against, say, somebody who a mask wearer and somebody who isn't. What did we find? Well, first thing first, we want to know whether our mask wearers innately more cooperative in public goods game than non-mask wearers. Well, we found that no, no evidence whatsoever. Here we have the non-mask wearers and the mask wearers. So non-mask wearers here is the black bar, and the non-mask is the blue bar. So when it's anonymous, we don't know anything. The cooperative rate is basically the same across two. So we can reject the null hypothesis that mask wearers are innately more cooperative. It's not the case at all. We have the simultaneous PD, public good gains. We also find the same evidence for sequential PD, which is basically asked, what happened if somebody did this first? How would you react? Same thing, no different. But when we move on to the second stage, and then we ask them about their face mask, and then we ask them, how would you play? We ask them to play the game again, but we don't give them any information. So even when they know that they are mask wearers or non-mask wearers, but if they're playing against an anonymous partner, no difference in terms of behaviors between mask wearer and non-mask wearer. That's the first panel. An interesting result appears when we look at, when we ask them, if you play against a mask wearer, how would you behave? Right? And this will affect the actual payoff. And we found that the mask wearers increase slightly their level of cooperativeness when they're playing another mask wearer, whereas the non-mask wearer reduce their cooperativeness when they were told that they're playing against a mask wearer. The trend reversed when we ask them, what happened if you play against a non-mask wearer, which is the third panel 3. We can see here, amazingly, non-mask wearers increase their cooperativeness. They actually cooperate almost 70% of the time, whereas the mask wearer reduced their cooperation to less than 50. So here we have clear evidence of in-group versus out-group bias. So first, definitely, there's no evidence that people who wear face masks are more cooperative than the others. But when they can see that they are dealing with somebody who are either from the in-group or the out-group, their behavior changed, and it changed significantly. And we thought, well, can this be explained by the political affiliation? Well, we found evidence that Democrats tend to be, I guess, more altruistic when they're playing against a mask wearer compared to Republicans. But here, in the data that we have, not all Democrats wear masks, and not all Republicans are non-mask wearers. They're a mixture, right? The average might be different, but not everybody would be. It's not 100% that if you're Democrats, you'll be wearing masks, or if you're a Republican, 100% that you will not be wearing masks. Basically, what we found was that even when we're conditioning for their political affiliation, the mask wearing itself still carry this strong signal of in-group versus out-group. So political affiliation doesn't explain away the phenomenon. So we conclude our paper that when we wear face masks, it signals something, and it might signal political identity. But obviously, not everybody who, like I said, not everybody who wear face masks are Democrats or Republicans. But what is readily observable is the face mask. And we take that as a strong signal of something, whatever that is, of in-group versus out-group bias. Now, what does this say to us? Well, it says that trying to convince people to change their behaviors is going to be so difficult. We can't just give them facts. Giving them facts alone will not change their behaviors. And that's what policymakers have been doing a lot. Sorry, just to conclude this one, there's a clear evidence of social identity effects. So the policy implications that public health messages on face masks, it's not going to change people's behaviors, because it's not going to change people's worldviews about it, because by because if it is the social identity that drive their behaviors, if they were to change their behavior, it would mean like a signal of this loyalty to their political identity, right? Or even just their social identity. So doing so would be very hard. So a better strategy, instead of trying to kind of bombard them with information about wearing face masks is good, is to focus less on the detail of the message, but more on the messenger or the information source. So messengers who are authority figures, share similar characteristics with and are likable to the target individuals tend to be more successful in getting their messages across. We call this the messenger effect. And since face mask is something that is so visible, it's so, we have this automatic reaction to it, we need to take that into account as well. It's not like, because there's a study on vaccine on whether or not people are more, whether there's in-group versus out-group behavior in terms of vaccine. They didn't find that for vaccine because vaccine are generally not observable, but face mask is. But then going forward, we might have this vaccine passport, which is much more observable than just the vaccine. So the question is, if we politicize as vaccine passport as they politicize face masks, then surely in-group, that will create a social identity issue, that will create a bias, and behavioral change will be much more difficult than if we didn't politicize anything from the start. And it should not be politicized because they are health measures. They should not, it don't relate to politics at all. I think I've used my time well. That's only 43 minutes. That's the last slide, actually. So let me conclude here. So there are 3 different studies that I talked about today that I've been fortunate to be involved in. One of them is about using Google Trends to evaluate people's well-being. You can actually extend that and do many, many other studies, not just about lockdown. As long as you know when things happen, right, daily when things happen, you can actually do before and after studies and using Google Trends as a proxy for people's well-being. There's a talk a little bit about the exit strategy, and also how to use game theory and all this experiment to learn a little bit more about people's behaviors, because we know that if we could get people to wear face masks, vaccinated, it will have a long-term impact, not only their behavior, but also their overall well-being as well. And I'll end here. I'll pass it back to Kelsey, and maybe we'll have some discussions.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting, intriguing set of findings. I appreciate it very much. So we have some questions in the chat, I think, that we can get started with. And then we also have a couple in the Q&A. So Adelina, I will offer you the opportunity to speak if you would like. However, if you prefer not to, I can answer the question or read off the question. So let me offer you the opportunity now and see if you would like to ask a question.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Adelina. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, so I feel, first of all, I would like to say that I'm very happy to have listened to your talk. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.
That's for me definitely one of the highlights of this conference.
Oh, thank you.
I've read your work. I presented my students, especially the paper on friends, neighbors, the value of friends, this life satisfaction. Anyway, so there have been some discussions yesterday about, that the impact on well-being wasn't so clearly negative found. And actually, in Italy, shortly after the lockdown, there was even a positive impact. And, there are several explanations to that, but, I keep on coming to the fact that maybe not all in this, of course, the pandemic was awful, but there were also some positives about it, not having to go to work, to commute, being more home with your family. Maybe if you are lucky enough to have a garden, to be able to use the garden. And I was wondering if, Google Trends might be possible to be used in order to look also for these positive ones and not only the negatives. So maybe we can learn also something positive from the whole situation and not necessarily just the negative. So the negative word searches, you understand what?
Exactly. First of all, thank you very much, Adelina. That's very kind of you to join us and to say what you said. Definitely, I think there's a huge opportunities here with Google Trends because you can look at by region as well. So it's not just the entire country. Of course, the limit of Google Trends is that it only limits to the people who use Google, right? And usually they're not representative in terms of the sample, but it does give us a lot of useful information over time and across different regions. I mean, from our study, we found that, well, it's not entirely negative, as you said. Uh, as we all know, well-being is a holistic measure, right, subject to well-being. So not only the things that, things like we know, just to give another different analogy, is that we tend to think that people who are disabled should be very, very dissatisfied with their life. Yes, partly true, but they also adapt. And we were quite surprised when they adapt. And we're quite surprised who are born with disability are actually quite happy. And that's only because we tend to focus our attention too much on the salient feature of that particular experience, right? So when we think of lockdown, we think of pandemic, when we might think that they must be so unhappy, or we must be so unhappy, because that's the most salient thing in our mind when we think about the effect of pandemic on our well-being. But in fact, we know that there are so many other things that could happen that could be positive as well. As you clearly said, we got to stay at home more, our social capital might go up. It really depends on the kind of policy as well, and whether does the government look after the people who have to go on furlough, which is like in the UK, stay at home and not doing any work, but then they still get paid for it, right? Yes, so I would say Google Trends can be used to study, say, the impact of different policy around the world and how they might impact people well-being on a different sort. It depends on what topic you're searching. Does that answer your question, Adelina?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. And I would like to see maybe in future more work on positive lessons that we might be able to learn from COVID and not just on the negative.
Not just the negative. I agree completely. Yeah.
Even though I would never say that it's something positive, but maybe there is something positive that we can learn from all this negative situation.
Well, I hope that one of the big lessons that we could learn is how to deal with the next pandemic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Adelina. Actually, there is some research, for example, on working from home. So in Luxembourg, we have a small amount of research on this that we produced last year. So I think it was the beginning of June, end of May, the majority of people did appreciate working from home at the time. And as we know, business structures are going to change to a degree. It depends on how long lasting some of this will be. But there is some research on the positive impacts.
That's great, because this doesn't seem to have come true to Britain, at least not in academia, where everybody wants to come back to the situation before, and people are more or less forced into going back into work. Yeah, so thank you for that. The only thing that I just wanted to add was about the masks. Yes, the first intuition that people wearing masks might be more cooperative is correct, but I'm not actually surprised that you haven't found a very strong effect, because into my opinion, maybe stronger than that is the anxiety. So maybe people who were wearing a mask but just anxious, or it could even be for people that are less cooperative and are more introverted, because they can hide more or less behind their mask. And also there was a very nice comment by Talita. She said that people wearing masks could be just more compliant. So that's a mix of things here that maybe not necessarily relate to the political orientation. So yeah, that was all that I just wanted to ask.
Thank you. I mean, I agree. There could be so many things that kind of determine why the decision to wear or not wear face masks. Obviously, we only look at one tiny bit, which is one theory, which is, are there any evidence of social identity, and how, if there is, how should we deal with that in terms of policy to try to get people to start wearing masks? But I agree with you that there could be many other factors that we haven't accounted for, and that should be studied.
Great. All right. So we have a few hands raised, and also a few questions in the chat and the Q&A. So I'm just going to move progressively through. Yep. As people raise their hands, etc. So Talita, you are next, and you can I believe unmute yourself and
Hi, Talita.
Hi, Nick. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I wonder if I can put my video on, but if not,
Sure, yeah.
Talita, I think unfortunately in the webinar
You
setting,
can't.
yeah, it's not so
that's a shame.
straightforward.
Thanks, Kelsey. Nick, first of all, thank you very much for that first paper that you used Google Trends data in. We use Google Trends data.
Great.
And we looked at your paper and studied it in depth.
Oh, wow, thank you.
We've published a few papers now also in PLOS using Google Trends data, but also using Twitter data. Now, my one question is, you pick up noise. What did you do with the noise? Even if you do a Google Trends search, you're not sure that everything is exactly related to your search word. So what did you do there? It was easy for us because we just cited you, and that was already like a so that helped. But we really want to get the data as close to without noise as possible. The same thing using Twitter. That's the one question. The next question, Google Trends give you an objective opinion. So we can't really measure the subjective feelings of people in Google Trends.
I mean, thank you for that. Well, my first response to that, it's a great question, by the way, is that you can never eliminate noise in this kind of data, right? What we could do but I think it applies to all social science research, that you need accumulation of supportive data. Right? So Google Trends is just one. It's just one indicator. So we're so glad now that there are studies that look at subjective well-being data in a similar way and found consistency between what we found and also what they found. It's not going to be 100% consistency. It's completely difficult or impossible. So we can only rely on other researchers either doing the same or doing something different, right? Things like papers by Eugenia Proto and in Nature Human Behavior that look at, like I said, the books and correlate that with the subjective well-being, and they found to be kind of consistent. So I would say now the next step is to look at Google Trends in terms of well-being search and correlate that with the average well-being across time, and just to see whether are they actually consistent. We haven't done that, but I think that should be
good idea.
That should be done, so that we can use that paper and say, okay, look, it's great. See, it actually is consistent. We believe it to be consistent, but we might need a more systematic kind of way to doing that. So that would answer your first question. I don't remember what your second question or comment was.
The second question is that Google Trends will definitely measure objective measure and not as much a subjective measure.
Yes, yeah, that's true. So that's another weak point about Google Trends, that if people search, it's just the word. It might not represent completely how we would feel. We just hope that because Google Trends, it's a huge data, so of course they'll, in terms of there might be some randomness to cancel out, right? So relying a little bit on the kind of large data, we might be able to, even though it's objective search, there could be some errors. If the errors are random, they should cancel themselves out. But I mean, it's early to say, and more research would need to go into this to actually see that the objective search in Google, does it really match subjective well-being? And my response to your first question should be able to address that, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talita.
Thank you. All right, we have a question in the Q&A from Larissa Poppel. And Larissa, if you are interested in asking it aloud, I'll give you the opportunity to speak. Allowed to talk. Oh, there we go. I think you have to unmute yourself, Larissa, if you want to speak. And if not, I can address your comment.
I mean, I can read this if you like.
It's in the. Do you see it in the Q&A?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay,
I can see
great.
that.
All right, so you can...
okay, so it's comment rather than question, right? So imagine a boredom might be searched for more than other well-being terms because it's the novelty of the pandemic lockdown experience. which is I can agree completely, and that people who are anxious and stressed might not search as much just because that inward look, when you feel depressed, you just don't want to do anything. So that could be part of it. I agree with that completely. I don't think we can prove that unless, like I said, my response to Talita, that if we could search and look at how consistent are different types of different words match with actual feeling. But of course, we need to ask people subjectively how they, how bored they are, how stressed they are, and just see whether or not they're consistent. I'm afraid I don't have any kind of immediate response to that because I think further research is needed. But I agree with you in that sense.
Great. And we have a question from Alberto Prati.
Hello, Alberto.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Alberto.
Thank you very much, and for this work, which is very important and very timely. And we know how hard it is to work on topics which are so on the spot. Congratulations with that.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you a comment about something that some colleagues of myself noticed about the differences in different well-being indexes on the effect that the lockdown seemed to have on them. In particular, life satisfaction seemed to be pretty stable across countries, while affective indexes such as anxiety and happiness had a sharp change around the lockdown. And I was wondering what we can learn from this in terms of what we're actually measuring and what we would like maybe to use for policy implications, since you worked a lot on that.
That's a very good question, Alberto. As you probably know, life satisfaction is an evaluative measure, right? And whereas affective, daily emotional experiences are kind of, well, it doesn't really require a lot of cognitive evaluation when we're answering that kind of question. So you can imagine the effect of pandemic. It would only impact our overall life satisfaction, I think, if it alters things that we use to evaluate well-being, things like jobs, income, social relationships, right? So all these huge things. If it doesn't, then it might not impact our life satisfaction that much. Or if it impact one area, but then it have negatively impact, but then positive impact the other area, then you can imagine life satisfaction could be stabilized. But of course, daily emotional experiences, things like how often you smile in a day, how happy do you feel today, it can fluctuate depending on how you spend your time, right? On a day-to-day basis. If you spend a lot of your time constantly worrying about things, if you watch a lot of news about the pandemic, and obviously that's going to have a huge impact on your day-to-day emotional health. So it really depends on, I guess, on what would be the policy goal. Now, this will open another can of worms in terms of public policy, because if you ask people like Richard Layard, who are prefer life satisfaction data, then he will say, well, we should focus on life satisfaction. But if you ask somebody else, like Arthur Stone, Paul Dolan, who prefer the kind of pleasure and pain on a day, they might value another scale more. So that really depends on how should we. I mean, I'm kind of a pacifist. I'm more of a balanced view that in order to have a balanced life, you need to have good satisfaction. Kind of life satisfaction doesn't vary that much, and also kind of quite stable day-to-day mental health. But yeah, I don't know how to answer. I don't know whether that answers your question or not. But I think it's just because of pandemic impact us in a different way. That's it, really. Different dimensions of life, or different dimensions of subsidy well-being in a different way.
It does definitely answer my question. Thanks. I would say the general worry for people working mostly on life satisfaction like me is probably, can it actually be used for timely policy evaluation if it's too stable?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, my approach now is if you have data on on different types of different dimensions of well-being, I would present them and kind of say how it affects different areas, but then kind of leave an open question of to policymakers on how they want to deal with this.
Yeah. Thanks again, Nick, and congrats again.
Thank you, Alberto. Good to see you here.
Thank you. We move to a question from Melanie Devern. Melanie, if you would like to speak, you are now able to.
Hi, Melanie.
Otherwise, I can answer the read off the question myself. It looks like you have to unmute. Oh, okay. So Melanie asked if I would read it off. So, okay. Looking at family violence statistics in Victoria, Australia, across a number of lockdowns, has seen an increase in family violence, with 1 in 5 crimes being family violence. So individual versus group effects are also important to consider.
Yep. Thank you. I do agree with that, and I think that's part of the negative impact of the lockdown as well. Domestic abuse. We've seen a lot of evidence that calls have been made. There's a huge increase in the call for help. But I guess I don't really understand. Follow your point about individual versus group effect here. Can you elaborate that a little bit more, Melanie? What do you mean by important to consider here?
So she may not respond, just because she'd indicated that that I should answer the question.
Right.
So you could imagine societal effects being a little bit different than the aggregate of individual. And so we have spillover. So you have, let's say, a young man, as you said, who's not likely to adhere, and then ultimately ends up infecting people in his family. So that's just an example of where, you can't just measure the impact on individuals, because the individuals may have spillover effects.
That's true.
And if you aggregate the individuals, is that different than, so there's I guess it's one of these ecological challenges in measuring subjective well-being.
Yep, that's true. I completely agree with that. Of course, I'm all for more individual subjective well-being whenever we can, right? So rather than at the household level or at the country level. So that's my preference as well. But I agree with you. Thank you, Melanie.
And Melanie, if we didn't answer your question, feel free just to respond further in the Q&A or chat, and we can try to address it further. Okay, and then the next person is Kanu Praya. And Kanu, if you would like to ask us a question, you are welcome to.
Hi, Kanu.
Hi, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation and sharing researches. I just want to ask, or maybe share something that, I'm an Indian and I'm living in Thailand, and I just observed that it's fascinating to see how the cultural value of collectivism actually plays out the way people are wearing a mask here. Last year, the pandemic situation wasn't too bad in Thailand, but now it is. However, even last year, I saw that people just continued wearing masks everywhere, formal or informally. And it's interesting to see and contrasted with the situation in India, in which they had a lot of cases recently, but the moment the lockdown opened, people stopped wearing masks. Yep. So I just wonder if you've ever looked into the cultural differences among people.
Well, first of all, thank you. I should say also that I am Thai. So I'm in the UK, so I know exactly what you're saying. My family in Thailand, and I am, I can see a lot of things happening over there at the moment, of how it was really great last year, but this year we just have a really bad case in Thailand. Personally, I haven't looked at the cultural differences. I know that the Asians, I myself an Asian, much more adhere to, in the beginning, to face mask rules, to all this. And partly it's because of the experience of SARS that we had gone through before, and also the air pollution that we had gone through. So the cultural difference could be, I guess it links to the social norm, right? So if the social code is that we wear masks, then we should wear masks and it's okay. And I remember, and this is, sorry, it's not really based on research, but on personal anecdote, that in the beginning in the UK of the pandemic, my wife and I were quite scared about wearing masks in public because it's not the culture here. And wearing masks do signal something when it's not the norm. So yeah, so we were very, very glad when the UK government came out and said, okay, we should start wearing masks, because then it shifted the kind of the cultural stance on this and the social code on it, and we felt much more comfortable. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but I think yes, culture plays a huge role, but culture can also be seen as a social code in the society, and it does have an impact on people's behaviors and people's well-being from that behavior. But I haven't done the research myself, and I think it's opened up that for that if people in this room would like to carry that forward, looking at the cultural effects of behaviors and well-being, that would be great.
I should add that Consuela made a similar point, Consuela Chua, about the Philippines. Just that she believes that it's a collectivist attitude or cultural value, rather.
Yeah. I think the issue about, and also we've seen like a contrasting evidence here in the Asian society and in America, where liberty and freedom and things that which usually would work really, really good for us, but it could impede when we need collective kind of actions, right?
We have another question from Talita, and I will give her the opportunity to speak. Looks like, Talita, you can just unmute yourself if you would like to ask the question yourself.
The question, sorry, me again. The question is, you know what, we often find this question with Google Trends or using any big data is compare genders, but you can't because you don't have that information, or compare cultural groups. Now, I've seen some work in Italy where they actually weighed with population distributions. Have you had any ideas about that?
Well, I agree with you that's one of the limitations of Google Trends data. We can't distinguish who. We can only distinguish by time and region, right? So I think we need to kind of do the kind of research that would complement that, and that is, you know, to maybe go on and do some, if you can use Prolific or Amazon Turks and do your own survey in the regions that you want to do, and trying to distinguish that, because then you can collect socio-demographic data and learn a little bit more about the mechanisms, albeit in a smaller sample, right? But then you can have a complement, kind of two different sources of data, one very, very aggregate and at a high level and a macro level, and one kind of the smaller sample, but would answer the question that you wanted to answer. I think.
It sounds like a good idea.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Clemens.
Hi, Clemens.
Hi, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for your very good presentation.
Thank
very
you very
intriguing. Just on the stability of life satisfaction, or the relatively weak impact of the pandemic on life satisfaction. It's more a comment. I think what we often observe is that life satisfaction, which should be about past achievements and your current evaluation of life, is often very forward-looking and about expectations and aspirations. And I think as long as the people expect it to be the pandemic to be a temporary phenomenon and lockdowns to end relatively soon, I'm not surprised that the life satisfaction impact was relatively weak and short-lived. I think this would change a lot when we would start to expect that, you know, we would have pandemics on a regular basis, or more variants and future waves with similar consequences. And I would expect also a very strong negative impact on life satisfaction, but only in the longer term. So this is yeah, just a comment, and you can agree and disagree.
No, I agree with that sentiment. So thank you very much for coming to that. But of course, there could also be adaptation, right? You could also adapt to pandemic. So there could be two different forces kind of push and pull at the aggregate level. So maybe the research going forward could be looking at individual heterogeneity of responses. So I know that data, people in psychology have used this. I don't remember what the kind of modeling it's called now, but they basically let the data speak for itself. And for example, in adaptation literature, we know that people adapt to bereavement. On average, they adapt completely. But when they let the data speak, the data distinguish people into 4 different types, right? People who adapt, people who never adapt, people who never actually experienced a drop at all, and people who actually became happier because their loved one dies, which is a very small proportion. So maybe that kind of technique could be applied to the pandemic and see who are these individuals who were not affected at all, who are the individuals who were actually cope and resilient very well to the pandemic. So I think there are many, the data could be very, very rich if we can apply that kind of a strategy. So thank you, Clemens.
Thank you.
So we are almost at the end, I think, in terms of questions, but everybody, please feel free to continue adding. There's a comment here from an M. Tsai speaking about Taiwan not wearing masks gets fined by the state. So in this case, it's not just a matter of culture. And then I have a question. I'll take my opportunity as the host here. So, when you think about what you've read in the literature and your own research using the Google Trends, and part of what we've just discussed, the relative stability of life satisfaction so far, how important do you think are the well-being declines in the scheme of things? And I'm thinking in context of, some who are arguing that because mental health is declining, that we should be releasing from lockdown earlier or, phasing it out as part of what you've argued for younger people. So, and now we know a little bit more. So maybe you can speak to that.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, I think this is the decision to whether, because we know that lockdown has a reason or has a rationale behind it, but staying in lockdown could also detrimentally impact people's, especially their mental health. And we have seen a lot of evidence on that now. Making the decision of when to release the lockdown is such a difficult question to answer, because you need to find a balance between all of these different things that are impacting our lives. So I think we need to be driven by the data, right? So we need to know, okay, who are being impacted by in terms of their mental health, and how are they being impacted? If they're being impacted by the fact that they lost their job, they're under lockdown, they lost their educational opportunities, and they're least affected by health, then the rationale would be, well, they should be released first. And that's the argument we have made before, because but for the people who are impacted in terms of mental health because they have fear of getting the virus, in terms of their health, or the risk of mortality, are they being the people who are being vaccinated first? And those are the generations, right? So in terms of public policy, we need to take a holistic view. And I think that's what the UK government has taken so far, and that is to shield the most vulnerable, to vaccinate the most vulnerable first, right? Because the fear, the effect of pandemic on their mental health are largely, well, the lack of social, the loneliness, the lack of social relationships. It's nothing to do with the job opportunities, right? It's the fear of mortality and the lack of social relationship. If they are being shielded and being vaccinated first, they could potentially see, and lower the risk of themselves when they're seeing other people. But if the young, then they should be given the opportunity to, to be out first, and that's why they, for the UK government, they opened everything in stages. And the first stage, the second phase that they opened was school, because they are concerned about the impact that the pandemic have on the young. So the school were open first, the first thing of the first release of the lockdown. So I don't know if this answers your question, Kelsey, but I think they need to look at, okay, how does it impact well-being and who are affected? And then they have to create policies that targeted each group.
Yeah, so it's answering. So what I'm thinking is quite broad, because it partially reflects several questions that have been asked before, related to Alberto's, and Clement's response about the stability of life satisfaction. So if life satisfaction is not being impacted, how important, should we take fear as an example? And let me add some to that. There was a paper yesterday presented looking at those who have, they had subjective well-being data on those who have recovered from COVID. And they found that their mental health had actually improved relative to a pre-period. It was a repeated cross-section, and they used matching to try to match. So, and my belief is that it's because there's an alleviation of fear, as you focused on. So, and then if you look at your Google Trends, we have an initial shock due to lockdown. And then there's a paper I have with Talita, Stephanie, and a couple other colleagues, where we use the Twitter data, and we see that there's a really strong and rapid rebound to lockdown. But then there's the well-being seems to trend downwards. So, and this was part of my earlier question, I believe, is, how serious should we take that initial decline in well-being that happens around lockdown? Or I'm remembering it.
Okay.
And how long it lasts.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good question that is difficult to answer. Like, I guess I already answered a little bit earlier about how do we target policy if one indicator shows a big huge rebound, but another indicator shows a decline, right? And of course, asking different people will give you different answers. Like I said, Bishop, they are people with different answers. Personally, I would see, well, if people have to put into a vote, right? It might vary from society to society. And Gus O'Donnell and Andrew Oswald did a work on this. If you ask people, in terms of priority that they give to different dimensions of their life, what would you give between happiness, life satisfaction, meaningfulness, and anxiety? In the UK, I think people give happiness slightly above that of life satisfaction. Right? So then you can say, okay, since this is almost like the reveal of the stated preference, we should give more weight to what happens to people's happiness or mental health. Right? And then give a slightly lower weight on life satisfaction to the policy. But of course, that could vary from society to society. Different society could say, we care more about life satisfaction, so therefore the policy should, if life satisfaction hasn't really declined at all, then maybe we should do nothing.
Well, so I'll just push for one last, and part of what I'm thinking is the duration. So how long does the shock last? And I'm thinking, I've been having these discussions, with my colleagues quite a bit regularly. And, I believe we make investments occasionally, lowering our affect, let's say to study for an exam, right? Because we believe it's going to have long-term benefits. So you may not have an answer. These are, it's kind of a philosophical discussion, but
it's a good one. To answer that question, and this is my own personal opinion about this, is how does that, let's say, short-term changes in well-being, whatever it's life satisfaction or mental health or even purpose, affect your decision at that moment that could have a long-term impact in your future, right? If it does, then we should care about it, because we know that people make important decisions in their life based on transient feelings sometimes. Actually, a lot of times we do that. If feeling blue today affects your decision to quit your career. Obviously, yeah, right. That will happen. Yeah, that is important. So I think I don't have a perfect answer for this, but I think we have to match it into the decision that we make on a day-to-day basis as well. Whether, you know, does that impact our long-term kind of our well-being over the life course, right? Decision.
Thank you. We have a question, a couple more now. So Daniela, I will allow you to speak and you can ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Hi, Danielle. Yes, of course, yes.
Hello. Thank you, Nick, and all of you. Both the presentation and the discussion here are very, very valuable, and I think that for each of us, and I hope that each of us can contribute. I was thinking that I would like to have a different question, given that I know Nick, how good you're in methods. What will happen if people will do the same analysis without scaling? Little bit the naive approach. And that is the simple question. And I will stop there, and then I will tell you a little bit more complicated. But my short question is, how will be the results in the case that you will not use scaling? Sorry, thank you.
Okay. So if I understand your question correctly, is that what if we don't care about the different scaling? Are you talking about the Google Trends research, the data, or?
Yes, you identify correctly.
Okay.
I'm talking about this approach, and then I will explain for you why I was asking the question without the naive part of the approach.
Okay. I think that if you don't care about scaling or rescaling rather, then the data might not be comparable from year to year. But it really depends on the frequency of the measure that you want to measure. Let's say if you want to just look at the weekly data, like what happens in the search intensity in a week rather than in a day, then you don't need to rescale because you have weekly data that dates back like 5 years, right? Depending on when. But if you want to look at daily data of Google Trends, the data only dates back to 9 months. And if you want data that beyond that, then the daily data between say in the first portion that you got and a different portion from that is 9 months apart will not be comparable, simply because Google Trends it's a relative scale, it's not an absolute scale. I don't know if that answers your question, but so therefore you need rescaling of the data to make them comparable because they would have a different weight. And I guess my response to that is that if we already provide a way to rescale it and it's easy to do, then you should rescale it, I think.
I agree with you, but now I will explain why I was thinking about this, and I respect totally, and I know that you are very good in the methods, and all of us want to have as good as possible the aspect of comparability. I was thinking mostly about the approach and the idea about people get informed, and into that aspect, if it will be possible to have comparable data at the week level, from a year to a year, it will be interesting. And also into that aspect with scaling, and because the time is changing, I'm thinking about another approach related that changes are done over the time, and people, if you conditional on the searching for information for COVID or related to some keywords for the changing. I would like to refresh to be more clear with my question. You show us the keywords, but over the time, it might be interested also to have conditional when people search not only for a word, if they, for example, search for COVID and the words what we are interested for.
Okay, so you mean like before COVID, people will not search for COVID or that kind of thing?
And during COVID, even Nick, even COVID period, let's say after January, after the time when the World Organization was defining or stating that we have a pandemic, it might be interesting to see if people search in combination or some vaccine combination and something like this.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I guess I don't really have much to add to that, because I think the world, it opens up to many possibilities that you can just play around with Google Trends and see what you could find. I have to say, I'm I'm not an expert on Google Trends myself. So I don't know how many different combinations that you could have and see how it, so I'm not sure I can answer your question, but Diener, if you have any, I'm happy to answer any email, anything that you have. That's probably easier for me to deal with, because sometimes I can't think on my seat. Immediate answer to that, if that's okay.
It is very okay. I only wanted to add, in the case that it was not more question, it will be interesting to have a little bit more specific about methods. That was my my idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roger, Daniela. Thank you.
And we have what may be a relevant comment here in the Q&A from Talita. So Talita, if you would like to go ahead and add, and then I think we are otherwise complete on Q&A and comments. So take this moment, everyone, if you have any last questions or comments, please feel free to add them now. And Talita, I'm asking you to unmute so you can speak.
This is just a comment, and interesting, we analyzed tweets related to vaccines, and for a few countries, also European countries and countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and just looked at the trends related to the attitude to vaccines, also the emotions towards COVID vaccines. And really concerning is that it has a negative trend. Since January up to August, the trend is negative. Anger is still increasing. Fear is still increasing. Your negative emotions are increasing. We can't say exactly why yet. The anger might be against anti-vaxxers. The fear, I thought, should have dispersed by now, but this is what our data is currently showing.
That is very interesting. I mean, you might even want to correlate that with the amount of fake news that's happening online across region and time, and whether or not it kind of correspond to that as well. That would be interesting.
We are looking at that, and it is definitely, there's a lot of fake news going around vaccines, and especially Facebook, though we can't get access to Facebook. Wish we could.
Yeah, and it's sad.
It is sad.
Yeah,
sad.
Yeah, but thank you, Talita, for that. That's really interesting. I think I have to look up your research to have a look at this.
That will be super.
Well, so I think that closes the session for the day. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Big thanks to Nick for the presentation, very intriguing, and then also this rather long Q&A session. If you have any other words, feel free to close us out.
Thank you very much, and that's it. Thank you, Kelsey, for hosting, and thank you everybody for attending and asking very interesting questions, and also give really good comments as well. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert in COVID, but we all chip in and do our best to try and to end this or alleviate the effect that it has on people's well-being as much as we can. So thank you. Keep well. Get vaccinated if you haven't already, and hope to see you all face to face in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.